So welcome everyone to this month's ReproNim webinar. We are pleased to return to a sequence of 4 monthly webinars that will come back home to our ReproNim investigators and feature some of our ReproNim technology itself after, perhaps 8 or 10 talks before from sort of our friends and collaborators and sort of outside influences. So this little inside look into ReproNim kicks off this month with Jeff, who will discuss the integrated application of ReproNim's principles and methodologies with the neuroimaging data model, specifically in support of the FAIR principles of interoperability and reusability of data sets. Jeff has the large experience in many projects. He co-leads the FAIR Data Informatics Lab at UCSD. He's been instrumental in the organizational leadership and development of both the FAIR principles and numerous interrelated scientific missions and organizations, including the Neuroscience Information Framework, SciCrunch, the DKNet portal, and Force 11. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Jeff.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so what I'm going to do today is going to give a bit of an overview of how ReproNim has been working towards making sure that data is fair, and that really becomes even sort of more critical now as funders and other organizations are really putting out more mandates for data publication and data sharing. So most people should already know that last year, so a year ago, NIH issued a new policy for data management and sharing that stated that all data must be managed and most data should be shared, and it should be shared as openly as possible and as closed as necessary. And this is built around a new data management and sharing plan that they introduced as well. Now, some key aspects of that data sharing policy is that scientific data is basically all the data that is required to validate and replicate research findings. They do define things that may not be considered research data, such as your laboratory notebook, case report forms, draft of scientific papers. But the important aspects of this are that all that data that can be used to validate and replicate research findings, need to be made accessible as soon as possible and no later than the end of the award itself. They want you to use established repositories. So in the neuroimaging domain, you have OpenNeuro, you have NDA, so there are a number of repositories, that can be targeted. But there's also, encouragement for data management and sharing practice that are consistent with the FAIR data principles. And so FAIR is something, that has been outlined for a number of years, and communities are, working towards, making data more fair. And so FAIR itself really consists of 4 principal components. The first is that data should be findable, right? So that if there's a data set that is used in a publication, that data should be findable somewhere and accessible, so that a user can access that information, or even with the advent of new AI ML techniques, that machines are able to get in and access the data and utilize it. The 2 other aspects that are critical for using data, for example, across studies, so doing meta-analysis, mega-analysis across multiple different data sets, are the interoperability and reusability components. So really, we want to make sure that data is interoperable, that there's sort of a unified potential view across data sets, and that the data is in a format that makes it easily reusable without having to do too much work. And then there are other A's and R's thrown in, for example, for attribution and recognition. Now, the main driving case for example, the I and the R aspects of FAIR really get to things such as data reuse stories, such as these, where we're talking about discovery and, for example, selection of cohorts across multiple studies. So, this small example basically highlights, a case where, a researcher might come in, to a set of data that's available in multiple places, and they want to see how a certain demographic, or assessment measure, is affected across, multiple populations. and relate that to, for example, here an anatomical measure. And how does the researcher find this information? How does she find variables that relate to SES? And really, this touches on a number of aspects of sort of a distributed federated query across a number of different data sets, right? Where we need to make sure that the data is aligned in a way that we can retrieve that across these different data sets. And that's really the criticality of the I and the R in FAIR. And this is driven by metadata, making sure that there is a consistent description of metadata, across the data set, and also metadata not just at the higher level. So a lot of repositories provide the persistent identifiers for data sets. They have standardized core metadata for the publication of data. But once you get past that sort of standard publication related metadata and perhaps a couple other attributes, once you get into for example, assessment measures, measures that are derived from, for example, the imaging data, there is no consistent storage representation of those in the repository, right? And so that is something that's critical that needs to be added on top of that information. And so again, FAIR principles, are what's going to drive sort of, the documentation of data sets. And again, this is something that's evolving and improving over time. So as more work is done, by ReproNim, and others in terms of better documenting data sets, pulling out the metadata, we'll have a richer and richer ecosystem. And I'll highlight that with one of the collaborations that ReproNim has. As well, in terms of how tools are coming out of this, to help researchers in dealing with this data. So to get FAIR data in the laboratory, I mean, this is just a plug to get back to NIH's data management and sharing plan. So they did put data management as a key aspect, of the plan. And good data management is basically where this all begins, right? So good data management requires good documentation, requires the collection of rich metadata, all in the preparation to make that data available to a broader audience. Okay, and so that is something that is critical within the laboratory, is for you to have the good data management practices where all this metadata documentation is captured along the way, so it's not an afterthought, right? It's a lot easier to collect this metadata from the beginning. And so when we talk about ReproNim, one of the things that, one of the concepts that we're dealing with is the concept of a data lake. And so a data lake is, basically a single store of data, right? That's, transformed in such a way that it can be used for visualization, analytics, querying, machine learning. And there are many different ways that, data lakes can be constructed. But one of the more common ways in terms of pulling these data lakes together is through the use of what's considered to be linked data. And within the ReproNim context, we sort of consider sort of two types of lakes, right? There's sort of the local lake. So as you're collecting your data, you're collecting data locally. And we consider that to be a repro pond, right? So a smaller collection of data that you might have locally from different studies, that's structured in a way that has appropriate metadata, that you can use, for analysis, or even, have ways to query across that itself. Then there's more global constructs such as the Repro Lake, where we have sort of global store where local data can be published to this more public instance. Now the Repro Lake infrastructure, the tools that sit on top of that, there are a number of different aspects to that. So NIDM is at the core of this. And that is backed by a set of Python tools. The NIDM itself uses something called Sparkle, which I'll introduce later. And then, for example, locally, you have a repro pond that may be powered by something such as BlazeGraph, whereas the Repro Lake, has, might use something, more commercial, something like Stardog, which has a community version, but is a cloud-based RDF store. So in terms of your local data, right? So again, motivation for structured data, I think, everyone understands that, the imaging experiments can be complicated, many different files and file types per subject. And so this is where, everyone in the community, should be aware, of BIDs and using BIDs as sort of a foundation for, structuring the data. And so, BIDS itself, is a standard used by OpenNeuro and other repositories. And basically, this outlines a way to provide your data in a structured format, and also provides a way to provide some structured metadata along with the data set itself. And there are tools, from ReproNim that will help in getting data into BIDS format. So tools such as ReproIn, which is based on HoodyConf. And so, there are these tools that will help you structure your data and get it into this basic structural format, and allow you to then attach, some metadata to that. Now, what ReproNim develops on top of that is what's called the Neuroimaging Data Model, NIDM. And so this is a set of specifications using standard for provenance capture that can define in a structured way and in an interchangeable, interoperable way aspects of the experiment, the results, the workflows, and this is built on a stack of semantic web technologies. And so when one looks at BIDS and IDM, BIDS and IDM are actually synergistic specifications where BIDS helps you organize the data, and IDM helps you sort of unambiguously describe that data. So taking the metadata that might be in BIDS and making it more interoperable and reusable. So this is done through RDF. So in terms of RDF, this comes out of early concepts about the web. Some from, for example, Tim Berners-Lee, where they envisioned a semantic web where information is understandable also by computers. So that there's computational access to data across the web. And this has really been picked up in what are called the linked data principles. And so here you have information stored in these resources where, in addition to having labels for things, they also have unique identifiers in the form of URIs. And these URIs then are persistent links to information about those things, right? So that if there's a URI, and this, URI is, also, can be used as, a web address, where you can look that up. And this sense of linked data then allows you to tie into many different types of information. And so, the RDF framework is so resource description framework is World Wide Web Consortium specification that is used to describe this type of data, and this is what NIDM is based on. And RDF really describes everything as a triple. So that's sort of a getting back to sort of the data lake analogy. We have this whole lake of triples that are sitting there where there are associations between the different objects that we are talking about. So within RDF, a triple basically has a subject, predicate, and object. So the subject is a resource. So in this case, in the example below, that's a scan that is defined in IDM, and you'll notice it has a unique identifier. There's a UUID attached to that scan. There's a predicate that basically defines the relationship. So here that has a acquisition modality. And then the object is, what is, the modality based on that relationship, right? And so that is what the object points to. So these simple triples can actually describe very complex data sets, very complex information. And the important point here is that because we're using standardized identities and identifiers for these objects, for example, any of the scans that relate to the same acquisition modality will be using the same ID for the object. And so, for example, below you'll see that the object is actually a URI. So the NIDM colon magnetic resonance imaging is what's called a Curie, which is a compact identifier. And you'll notice that the full identifier, the full URI, is basically a URI construct with the identifier, which in this case is magnetic resonance imaging, is tagged at the end of that URI. And so this is a way that you can, and a lot of times when you're looking at RDF data, you'll see these, NIDM colon or Uberon colon, right? Those are the compact identifiers that can be expanded into their full unique URIs because we know what NIDM colon converts to. So a NIDM experiment, right? This is the experimental description of an imaging study. And what you'll see is that, you'll have a project, you'll have, various types of information that is contained within the project. And so this is something that, for example, is available, in the bids metadata where they describe the project, right? So this can be automatically brought into an IDM a graph. Then there are a number of sessions potentially, so imaging sessions, and then acquisition activities that are part of those sessions. Those are associated with scanners, and that brings in the actual entities that were generated, and these are the files, for example, that resulted from an imaging session. And so all this can be represented as these collections of triples. Here's just a simple, example of what something like that might entail. So on top, we'll see that there's a NIDM acquisition object, right? And so there's the DICOM related information that's associated with that. Some additional information, and also potential information on slice timing, and what contrast type is. So this is all these triples here are related to this acquisition object, and so this is a very common way to display this RDF information, where you first have the subject, and then each line under that is sort of the predicate and the object, right? And so again, objects can be identifiers, or for example, when you're talking about concrete numbers or values, they can also be values themselves. So for example, the echo time and the flip angle in this example. So, this NIDM RDF graph, gets built upon. So you can develop this, in terms of, moving from bids to NIDM. But then you can also, as you go on to attach additional information to this, it's a very extensible, these knowledge graphs, what they're sort of called nowadays. Are very expandable and extensible in the sense that since everything's built on a triple, if you want to attach some additional information to a subject, to a scan, or even to a set of scans, that can be easily accomplished just through constructing additional triples that lay on top of this. So for example, NIDM results, for example, brings in the concept of computed volumes from software such as FreeSurfer, where you then can tie in that information, and you can link that information back to then community ontology. So for example, if you're doing calculations of volumetric measurements, you can tie that back to ontologies such as Uberon, which provide information on sort of anatomical structures, so that there's a consistent definition of these anatomical regions across studies, so that you can pool that data potentially, from multiple studies. And there are a number of tools, that are made available through NIDM, to be able to basically, develop, these representations. of these BIDS data sets via what's called PyNIDM. So in terms of annotating your data, so as I mentioned, PyNIDM is the Python library to manipulate the neuroimaging data model. Okay, so this is something that allows you to do many different things around developing NIDM data and annotations. So the first one is really BIDS MRI conversion to NIDM. So there's a specific tool within PyNIDM which allows that. There's full documentation for PyNIDM and gives you examples for how you would use that in many cases. And there's also a set of sort of initial tutorials on how would ReproNim do certain things. And so one example we'll take here is for adding annotations is how would ReproNim manage local free surfer results. So as I showed in the previous slide, you've already done your BIDS to NIDM conversion, with PyNIDM, and now you want to add some additional information that you might want to query across. And so, in terms of managing, these free surfer results, there is initial instructions on, how to do that. Something to note, we're also working on sort of an updated version of this documentation, which should be available, in, the next month or so, where we can, provide sort of a full run through on the use case. And basically, the idea is that, when you're running this tool, SegStats and IDM, you're running this for, each subject, and it pulls in the information from, the resultant information from FreeSurfer, for example, and then bundles that up in terms of these triples and attaches it to the graph that already exists. So again, it takes FreeSurfer subject directory as input and uses the information from the stats files generated and encodes them in NIDM. There's other types of information that is also important for making sure that your data set is interoperable and reusable, and that gets to sort of the element descriptions in BIDS related to participants files. So the assessments, the demographics that one collects, from research subjects. So if you want to be able to select appropriate cohorts across subjects, you need to make sure that this data is also structured in a common way. So there is ways. So in the same how would ReproNim do that? There is description of how one would do that with PyNIDM, which is a tool called CSV to NIDM. And basically what this does is it goes out and it actually queries a collection of common data elements and information about the assessment. So for example, if you're doing a handedness assessment, so you might have the Edinburgh or the Arnett, or you might just be asking a question about handedness. Those are all separate handedness measures, but the names of the columns in your assessment files, may be different. You have different questions about handedness in some of the scales, and so you need to sort of align that information to common information. So, for example, handedness is really a question about laterality. So that if you want to find all measures of handedness, you can actually query along more conceptual means, to find all measures, all data sets that have a measure of handedness, for example. So again, CSV to NIDM is the way through PyNIDM, where you can actually do this type of alignment. But again, doing this through command line and question answering can be a little tedious. And so, we have again, if one looks at all this in sort of overview, right, you have, NIDM and associated tools, that will work on certain data sets, where you can, add these annotations, and that then ends up exporting this information as what are actually called turtle files, which has all the bids information and the annotations that have been added either for results or for assessment measures into a standard structure. Now, as I mentioned, some of this is not, as easy for users to do. So here, what I wanted to do was, highlight a collaboration, that ReproNim has with the NeuroBagel project, and this is something JB Pauline and Sebastian Erks have been leading, and this is a collaboration where they've been developing an annotation tool that sits on top of this type of semantic web data, so you can actually more easily generate this alignment, so improve the interoperability and reusability of, for example, the assessment measures, so you can do cohort selection across different data sets. And so there are multiple aspects to this. In terms of the work that they're doing, some of this initial work is focusing on Parkinson's data across, multiple resources that have data from Parkinson's subjects. And it also implements something that I hadn't mentioned before, but really the idea of federated search. So when we talk about federated search, this is search across multiple repositories or multiple data collections, right? And so this is something that can be enabled also through these semantic web technologies. And then sitting on the back end, is a tool such as DataLad, which is something that is a core ReproNim tool, but allows for sort of this distributed data access across repositories. And the community around sort of this data and the system involves lots of different partners, lots of different repositories. There are different ontologies, for example, SNOMED, and others that are brought in. There's work from some other NIDM ontologies in terms of NIDM terms, which was looking at, how does one appropriately tag data sets, for example, in Open Neuro. And so this is something, that is really a community, has been driven, from, a lot of work in the community. And, there is now, through NeuroBagel, there's now a way to find and retrieve, cohort information across a number of different repositories. And it has a query interface where it runs to facet and basically highlight and slice and dice the data set based on certain characteristics. So that is really important for users to have these types of simple tools. And again, this is all building on sort of these semantic web standards. Now, I mentioned that the critical aspect is sort of this idea of data federation. And so when we look at data federation, it can be federation even on the local side. So in your local lab, you have people collecting different studies, doing research in different areas, but overall, that collection of studies can be constructed in a way to make them more, again, interoperable and reusable through the appropriate annotation of the subject assessment measures and of the resultant data. And that is something that allows one then in their local lab to benefit from the years of research that's been going on to be able to query across the subject cohorts. One can also add in then the idea of these public lakes that are available. So ReproNim ReproLake, data at Open Neuro, data that might exist at another collaborating site. So one can pull all this data together and start querying it in a federated manner. And that's exactly sort of what the design goals of NeuroBagel are, is to allow sort of federation of remote and local data. And also, one of the things that they're looking at is some of the important aspects of what happens if, there are sharing constraints on certain data across this federation. So, this is important work being done. And the key part to get there is the way to allow users to actually do the annotations. And so there is an annotation tool that is being developed, as part of NeuroBagel, and that allows people to basically gather the metadata that is to be aligned and then harmonize it by attaching it to, the appropriate vocabulary terms or ontologies. So, for example, that Parkinson's disease is, for example, the disease that is identified by a specific ontology, for example, in this case, SNOMED CT, that whenever anyone is defining Parkinson's disease, they're attaching to that same identifier so that if one is searching for, a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease across all these remote and federated data sets, they can all do it based on, the linkage in this semantic triple to the concept of Parkinson's disease represented by that SNOMED CT identifier. And again, so the annotation tool is something that allows, the users to graphically come in, select the columns, for example, from, their participants' descriptions, and align that with, the common metadata identifiers and terminology. Now, the important aspect here of making tools like this more extensible is that what you're really doing when one is creating this annotation is that one is creating sort of an enhanced data dictionary. So most people hopefully are familiar with the use of a data dictionary when defining data that is available in a spreadsheet. So you might have to define a more descriptive name of the column in your spreadsheet, what that column means, and some aspects of that column. So, for example, if you have a column, just take age, for example, the data dictionary would describe, that potentially this is the age of the subject, what unit it is, so it's years or months, so that people who are using that data can sort of understand what that information is, so they can use it. Now, the semantic data dictionary takes it one step further in that it also aligns, the type of information that is described for a column in your in a spreadsheet, for example, to these semantic descriptors, right? So, if something is male or female, that male or female are represented by, these concepts that are globally usable, by researchers, so that it isn't 0 or 1 or MNF, right? But there's that additional semantic description of that information, and that's contained in that semantic data dictionary. And this is something that can potentially be used by multiple tools. We want it to be related and build on the bid specification, right? So that it could be included there. And it also allows for progressive refinement of data, so that, for example, if a data dictionary is initially spun up and perhaps someone doesn't have, hasn't done the semantic alignments, those can be added down the road. And so, this is something, for example, that would look something like this. So this is a JSON version of semantic data dictionary. And what you can see is that, for example, when one looks at, the annotation for sex, you also have male and female that are then related to, the concepts for male and female. These actually come from the the National Cancer Institute terminology, which is a well-curated terminology ontology of a number of different open biomedical ontologies that they maintain. So when we look back at our original picture where, you had NIDM and NIDM tools, that were doing, a number of the annotation, here we now have, a JSON semantic data dictionary that, has been made available. And, what we can now do is that JSON data dictionary can actually be used for doing the transform of this data. So again, this is work that is currently ongoing in terms of how one can use these semantic data dictionaries. So this is sort of work that we're currently working on. And now this is also a framework that can be generalized. And so one of the things that we want to enable, and this is something building off sort of the construction of the semantic data dictionary, for the subject assessments, but also what I had previously mentioned in terms of the generation of annotations based on derived data. So, for example, the free surfer segmentation results. And so these data dictionaries can also be used to describe in a more general way, this derived data. And so, ability to extract pipeline specific metrics. So here, what we can do, we can actually specify a data dictionary for metrics that are being extracted and allow NIDM then to use that data dictionary, an associated file that will describe the software tool being used so that we have appropriate provenance, but use this information, to then basically bring in, in the example shown on the right, for example, information from fMRI prep, right? So if someone has run fMRI prep on their data, we would be able to have a standardized data dictionary and a tool that will allow that to bring that data in. And so that's how we're currently, looking to extend the concept of these semantic data dictionaries and the prior work we've done in terms of derived results, from FreeSurfer, and trying to package that together to allow researchers to more easily add annotations around, derived data that can be extracted from their imaging data. And there are a number of tools that we're developing for enabling access to results, for example, in the Repro Lake. So here, we have a meta search query builder that's attached to Stardog through an API that's available, and that allows for a graphical cohort selection across the NIDM Repro Lake. And so there are a number of graphical tools that are being worked on around that, but to give people sort of a little understanding of sort of what sits under these tools, and that is really Sparkle. And so Sparkle is an RDF query language. This is something that runs large resources such as Wikidata as well. It is a standard also from the World Wide Web Consortium. So it was became a standard in 2008. And is maintained through that. And basically, the queries look very similar to SQL queries. As I mentioned before, where you have the queries that sort of define how you take something like NIDM colon and expand that, you'll see on here that there is the way to expand NIDM with these prefix definitions. You then basically do, like a select query where you define the variables, and then you define the graph that you're trying to match. So I'm not going to get this into any detail. The learning RDF takes, a little longer than I have time for today. But basically what you're doing is you're defining a graph that you're trying to measure or trying to retrieve. It's a little bit different than SQL, but it's basically a very similar concept. Now, within IDM, there are a number of ways to query data on your local ReproPond. So this is something where you can use the PyNIDM query, which is parameter-based queries. So PyNIDM can take parameter-based queries, convert those into standard Sparkle constructs, and send that query along. In addition to Sparkle queries that you can run through PyNIDM, you can also load data into a local store, something like BlazeGraph, where you are able to query that data. And so, for example, PyNIDM parameter-based queries again, this is in NIDM documentation, provides, a number of ways to query your data, through standard command line options. And you can also send in Sparkle queries. So you can submit, for example, the query down below to the left, and get results out in a CSV type format. And now with the ReproNim ReproLake, again, this is a more global store of information about data from some large studies. And that is something that can also be queried. So for example, here, you can query that data through, for example, Stardog, which it exists in, and same type of Sparkle queries across these global tools. So again, you have a global way to query the information through Sparkle locally and remotely. And this is just a more complicated query, for example, on the ReproLake, where you're looking for example, T1 weighted images. You're looking for information about the subject, such as age and gender, and pulling that all together, from the available RDF store. So again, this is a work in progress. So there are a number of tools that are already out there. What we're working on, most recently is to make some of these tools, more user facing, right? So these are the collaboration with Neurobagel, some of the graphical tools that we're putting together, but then also trying to, have the ability to bring all the different types of data and annotations into an IDM structure. So, not just, again, free surfer results, but any derived data, and also, the way to bring in all the subject assessments. So you do have a very queryable Repro pond of your own that can be used. Now, in terms of additional resources, I put these in the slides just so that some of the links that were done in the presentation, that those are all available. And that is sort of the end of my formal presentation. But I did want to point out and just basically let everyone know that the next episode in the ReproNim webinar series will be on April 5th. And that will be a talk that's a topic to be determined, but will be given by Satra Ghosh, who is the leader for TR&D2 within ReproNim. Cool.
Great. Thanks a bunch, Jeff. Sorry for my background noise. Questions from the community? Okay, so I'll start with one. Is there going to be, in the long term, sort of performance issues if we put everything in the world known to humankind, every bit of information, every open neuro, everything into one, especially the public stuff, into one store? Or does this have to ultimately federate or get distributed in some way?
I mean, that all depends on resources, right? So, I mean, Wikidata itself, so that's all of Wikipedia, right, is in an RDF store that's maintained, by Wikipedia. So Wikidata is built off that, and so there are infrastructure needs when the graphs grow, and it really depends on how many triples there are, how many users come in at the same time. So, I mean, there can be a central store for, uh, I'd say, most of the public data. But again, that all depends on, if the infrastructure resources are there. I mean, but there's also the sort of the concept of, many groups are maintaining, for example, their own repositories, or there are other repositories. So does it make sense for, the data in Open Neuro, for example, to be replicated, or, do they maintain, for example, their own endpoint that can be queried in a federated manner? So, I mean, that's, an open question of, what's best, for the community. There's, also, when one starts getting into some of the more complex querying mechanisms, so I highlighted the fact that Neurobagel, one of the things that they're taking on is how does one help query across, for example, sites that have protected information, right? And so you don't have access to all the data, or not all the data is visible. And in that case, it would probably need to be federated in that case, because the local endpoint will have its own authentication authorization restrictions, for coming in with a query.
Yeah, so definitely some level of federation seems like it's destined, to be part of this.
Yeah.
Other questions from the group?
I can ask the question that we've been kind of thinking of and brainstorming on with Seb. A bit related to the can we put everything on the same graph with the same model aspects. I can see some like having a usefulness of a more specific community-based data model that would make things easier to manage and maybe quicker to search, or less more maintainable in some, like if the maintenance of those things is more like also distributed in some ways to communities. I wonder if I'm just brainstorming on this and really to get your advice and thinking of that on that question, so my own kind of like thinking was, okay, yes, there will be some data elements that are going to be common, and we should make sure that those common data elements, like maybe age, subject ID, or things that are very widespread. But there will be a bunch of things that like the infant neuroimaging community might not be very linked to the electrophysiology in monkeys kind of a community, right?
Right.
So what do you think of having some ways of specifying a scope of a community and and the variables on which the query is useful, rather than like having a generic thing on and a query tool that will try to span everything on everywhere, which is likely to be difficult to use, or like or has some cumbersome aspect to it. What's your thinking on that problem?
Yeah, no, so I think, a lot of this is going to be community driven, right? So in terms of defining, the data elements they're using and the annotations on top of that. Now, the nice thing, just like with SQL databases, with RDF, you can also sort of create, your own views on that, right? So your own sort of triples that sit, that build off, the underlying graph, and that can be done based on community. But for example, if you as a community define, a certain element, right, I can actually, if I want to bring that in, to, let's say, my community, and there's slight differences, there are ways to define things such as same as relationships or other types of relationships that sort of, dock, your annotations into what I have done. So again, this is something that can be the sort of the annotations of communities in terms of what they're looking at, what they might deem important, are things that can then be further aligned across other communities. So it is, it doesn't have to be a global, thou shalt do it all this way, right? So the idea of having these views that build on top of some of the core data, to, as you said, to have more simplified queries, or to do things in a specific way for a community, are things that can all be done on top of sort of this the base semantic layers themselves.
Seb, do you have some thoughts on that as well, or what's your take on the question?
My thoughts on this? Yeah, I guess it's yeah, I don't know. I think my thoughts are we will have to see where the model doesn't fit the use cases and then decide together at what point it goes beyond something that can be shared, like Jeff was saying, right? And I kind of like this idea of a tiered system. At least to me, that makes sense. So have the sub communities do the churning of the semantic mud until they come out with some nuggets of gold, and then we can slowly migrate that into a central model.
Yeah.
Maybe something like that. And there's going to be limits, of course, but
Right.
I think we're gonna have to figure this out.
Yeah.
Soon, but ideally there's always a common core that we can agree on. So there's some similar language. I think the analogy I liked, I don't know who we're talking to, but it's like going to a party and talking to somebody about the weather versus your research, you know. You need to use a different language for this. Like everybody can talk about the weather. It's not very detailed, but it's good enough. And then if you have to talk about what you're doing, then you're not going to be talking to that many people, but at a deeper level of
Yeah.
precision and detail. And that's going to have to be agreed upon with a smaller group of people, I think.
Yeah. No, and Seb, I mean, I completely agree in terms of your sort of the layered approach. You know, I think that's, the only way that it can reasonably be done, because this is going to be done by smaller groups looking at their data, you know, the research they want to do, right? And so the annotations are going to, not be driven by, someone just going in and annotating, right, the data. You know, they're going to annotate their data for a purpose, for a research question, and then, hopefully, as those layers get developed, as you said, we'll be able to align some of that across those studies, and luckily for, in the RDF model, you can build those relationships across those types of layers. So
if I can ask another one quickly.
sure.
I was
Go to
also thinking of the extension of that model. So we are talking about communities of and depth aspect. I think that applies very much to the derived data as well. I was interested in thinking, okay, like so Michel is working on this NIPOP thing that is a deployment, a local deployment of processing, and it looks to me that if we can manage to hook on, okay, there's a standard way of organizing data, bits derivative like, bits phenotypic like, bits like, all those things. If there is a layer on the top of that extract quickly those things and annotate in the same way those brain derived data, I think there's a way of increasing the capacity to automatically annotate those things through those tools that get installed in the various places. So yeah, I think there might be like a win-win sort of kind of aspect to those to that. Yeah.
And I think there's ability to sort of, that could actually end up being a little more standardized, because the actual data dictionaries for the different derived data that people are looking at, if it comes from some standard tools, those data dictionaries could potentially be shared, right? So that if someone develops sort of an fMRI prep, for, as an example, a data dictionary, right? Someone else doesn't have to build that same data dictionary, right? They can just come grab, the data dictionary that's already been done, download that and use that, to annotate their data further.
Okay. Unless there's any burning questions, we're coming close to the end of our official hour. I'd like to thank you again, Jeff, for the presentation, and thank all of our attendees for attending, and we hope to see you again at a webinar in the future. Thanks all. Have a good day.